Hey everyone, it's Russ, and welcome to another episode of Women's Retirement Radio. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Kyla Lyons. Kyla is a family law attorney here in Atlanta, and we're just going to have an interesting conversation that we wanted to share with you. So, Kyla, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I have to admit, this is my first podcast experience, so I feel I feel a little younger.
Well, I guess that's not a bad thing. I guess I'm happy to play a role in that to
Right.
some degree. Well, I'm glad you could join. I'm glad you could join us. I think there's a lot of interesting things we can talk about today. But why don't we start by you just telling us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what it is you do.
Sure. So I am the newly minted managing member is the technical term, but most people would just call it a partner at Richardson, Bloom and Lyons here in where our offices are in Midtown. We are all family law all the time. I think actually all of our the Richardson part just recently retired, but our three partners have only practiced family law exclusively, I think, the entirety of our legal careers. And before I joined this firm, I was a staff attorney for a judge named Cindy Wright in Fulton Superior Court for 9 years, and we were in the family division the entire time. So this is all I have done. I originally, if you want to go back into the full-on details, I grew up in a tiny town in Ohio that is 2 hours from any place you've ever heard of, and desperately wanted to get out of Ohio when I graduated from high school. So I did a stint in college in New Jersey and then moved to Atlanta for law school, and it stuck. So I've lived here longer than anywhere else. And I am very happy to practice family law. I love what I do, and there are not a ton of lawyers who can say that. So there you have it.
Yeah, and I was very deliberate when I introduced you as a family law attorney, and you've since referred to yourself as practicing family law, as opposed to a lot of my clients and I think a lot of the public would think of you as a divorce attorney or a divorce lawyer. So could you talk a little bit about maybe the scope or the breadth of all you do, maybe outside of just dealing with divorce cases?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, when you think of when I think of family law, part of the thing that my firm in particular, our philosophy is recognizing that even when people divorce, they still, especially when they have children in particular, they're still going to be a family. They're just not an intact family anymore. So yeah, divorce law is a big part of that. But we also handle, especially in the last 20 years, we see a lot more cases where folks weren't married, but had oftentimes even a long-term relationship with children. And so family law, the scope of family law includes handling custody cases in that context. In Georgia, something called legitimation, ensuring that children have inheritance rights from both parents when they're born out of wedlock. And then subsequent to divorce, post-divorce, occasionally folks need to modify their custody schedule or their parenting time with a child, or modify their child support obligation or alimony obligation. So there are certain pieces of a divorce that can be modified post-divorce. So we deal with those things. And then we also deal with contempt cases, which is when one side is not complying or is not obeying the court order that has arisen out of their divorce. And so we handle those. And then finally, all of the attorneys in my firm do what's called guardian ad litem work. And that is when essentially if parents can't agree on what a custody schedule is supposed to look like, the courts appoint, in most circumstances, an attorney to investigate the situation and eventually make a custody recommendation to the court. I'm proud to say my partner, Dan Bloom, is one of, if not the best guardian ad litem in the state. He's extremely sought after, and he has trained most of us throughout the state very well. And then finally, I guess I said finally last time, but part of being a divorce lawyer or a family lawyer is really, you got to be part counselor. You're dealing with people who are going through an extremely emotional thing that is actually can be a very happy experience for some people and a very traumatic and very sad experience for others. And so, it's a big piece of this is knowing your role, and helping your clients understand when, a good therapist can help, but at the same time, you have to come into this with a level of empathy and understanding for people's personalities that is definitely unique to family law.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that last part about the empathy and sometimes the need for an actual therapist. But I imagine you often serve as an amateur therapist quite often. I mean, imagine the perfect storm of dealing with money, dealing with children, and often dealing that in an environment of conflict. I mean, that's as much as I think people would like to think we're going to be cool and calculated about this. It's a very emotionally charged experience for all parties involved. So I think the fact that you guys do and are willing to bring a sense of empathy and just treating people like humans, I think is important. I think that's often kind of almost joked about, that attorneys don't serve in that role or aren't capable of serving that role. So I think it's important that you shared that, and I'm happy you did. And as I understand it, Kyle, you also serve as a mediator and or an arbitrator, correct?
That is correct. Part of my background and having worked for a judge for 9 years, I think brings a unique perspective for me on my practice into my practice, because I have seen these cases from a more neutral perspective, right? And so even when I'm acting as an advocate, it allows me to reality check my client and and say, I've worked for a judge. I know how judges see these things, and that's typically how we evaluate all of our cases. Is the vast majority, 90%, don't ever see a judge. You go to you settle your case, and we encourage settlement. But at the same time, you always have the fallback on, well, worst case scenario, we're going to court, and this is how a judge would assess your case. And so I have that for my clients, but it also helps me to serve as a mediator and arbitrator, because you kind of bring that neutral perspective that all attorneys just don't have, because we're kind of taught to be positional and dig our heels in on a position. And that's just not always the best way to serve your client, especially again in family law cases. There's always a cost benefit analysis that goes into it, which I know as a financial person you can understand.
Absolutely.
And there's always a cost benefit analysis for the emotional cost of something. And so serving as an arbitrator, and to the extent I need to explain the difference, arbitration is binding and you are more judge-like, and whereas mediation is purely voluntary and non-binding on folks. But so I tend to do a little more mediation than arbitration. But the idea is that it is always better in family cases for people to reach their own agreement, even if they don't like parts of it, than it is to have something life-changing imposed upon them by a stranger who, frankly, knows nothing about them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a lot in there, some of which we'll probably want to revisit in our conversation here today. But before we move along, why don't you've already shared a lot about you being from a small town in Ohio, college in New Jersey, landing in Atlanta, several years ago, and kind of calling this home ever since. But what's an interesting tidbit about yourself that maybe most people wouldn't be aware of?
Well, so I don't know that this counts as interesting, but a couple of things. I actually spent quite a large chunk of my life in West Virginia. I don't own that very often, so no offense to your West Virginia listeners, but and then I probably spend the majority of my my budget on concerts and music venues. So I have traveled extensively solely in pursuit of the perfect concert.
Well, I guess that's been on a hiatus here the last year or
Right,
so for
right.
so you've probably been in withdrawal.
I've shifted that to Amazon purchases.
I don't think you're alone, and I don't think you're alone in that situation. But what's the best concert or musical performance you've seen in the last few years that jumps to mind?
That's an easy one. I have a very good friend who is also an attorney and a family lawyer and former judge. And a couple of years ago, she was never really a Springsteen fan. I've been a Springsteen fan since 7th grade. And so I dragged her along with me to a show at Lakewood, and it was amazing. And she was an instant fan. And then 2 years ago, she scored front row seats to Springsteen on Broadway. And her husband said, "I can't go with you. You got to take Kyla." So the two of us got to sit front and center for the Springsteen Broadway show. He handed us guitar picks at the end. I might have physically assaulted him just a little. He handed me the guitar pick, and I realized that taking that out of his hand meant that I wasn't actually going to touch him. So I grabbed his wrist, just startled him a little, It was fine. I didn't get carted out. But yeah, that's hands down. But I got to see the Rolling Stones here a few years ago. She did that for me, the friend who took me to Springsteen. I was not a huge Stones fan, but I got to say, Mick Jagger has more charisma in his pinky than, the majority of the other musicians I have ever seen.
Well, and he probably needs it to help keep Keith Richards alive.
Right. Well, I got to tell you, Keith's got more charisma in his index finger than most people. The two of them on stage, it's kind of amazing when you see them, the just natural energy. It's you can't harness it and you can't explain it.
So we could probably talk music all day because I'm a music lover too. But with things starting to open back up, is there any concerts that you're planning to attend in the coming weeks or months that you're excited about?
Well, my husband, I'm actually saying that out loud. I just got married on Saturday. So there's the other
congratulations.
The divorce lawyer got married. And I think that's the first time might be the first time I've said my husband. But he and I, one of our Venn diagram of things in common are his musical taste in some ways is very different than mine. And then we overlap quite a bit. And we've been, looking for the perfect music festival. But we keep telling ourselves, just be patient, just be patient, just be patient. So we have tickets to see a band called Clutch in Asheville in September. But that's our first one back. But we had there was a music festival in Napa that we looked at getting tickets for, and it just kind of wound up being an obscene amount of money. And there's a festival in Chicago called Riot Fest. Yes, that sounds like it's for the kids, I know, but we looked at that, and I don't think we're going to be able to make that happen. So we're trying to cool our jets and be patient.
Well, first of all, congrats on the wedding. That's awesome, and look at you, being on podcasts and going to music festivals. So
I know.
You're living the dream and keeping yourself young. So I think we've already kind of covered this ground. So I don't know that we need to rehash kind of explaining what it is you do and things like that. So kind of extending that idea, what would you say in your experience is the biggest challenge that you help people address or solve? And I guess maybe in the context of a divorce.
Sure. It kind of, obviously, it depends on the issues, right? There are a lot of folks who come into me. The first thing I would say is my goal always with any initial meeting with a client is that they leave feeling better than they came in, right? So a lot of folks come in for their first meeting having this new, huge life-changing situation put upon them because they're not the ones choosing to get divorced. And they're, obviously in a very emotional state with no knowledge of what the future holds. And so that oftentimes can be just, that first meeting that goal is not always attainable, but I would say I have, there are a lot of times when people are leaving that first meeting where, they just hopefully feel a huge sense of relief because they've been educated. But it really depends on what the issues are. Oftentimes people will come in and say, I think we're going to work out the financial issues. It's not that complicated, but the custody issues are hard. We see a lot of divorce cases with special needs kids. When you've got a special needs child, the divorce rate is actually much higher than I think most people are aware the divorce rate's about 50%. With special needs kids, it's higher than that, just because of it's much harder to be on the same page with how to parent children in that circumstance, unfortunately. And then, obviously when we're, cases like you're probably a little bit more familiar with, when, it's a complex asset division, trying to explain the different sort of buckets and the different types of assets to somebody who may not be particularly savvy about the financial picture. It can be quite challenging as well. And so it really just kind of depends, right? And then you have the big one where there's the custody issues and financial issues, and you've got a bunch of complex things to tackle, and to just make sure your client's educated and understands the process, because as I said before, it's just we understand that it's a scary thing to a lot of people.
Yeah, I guess ultimately we're talking about people here. So
right.
I'm not surprised to hear you say it depends. And I guess people bring different circumstances and situations and mindsets and emotional baggage to the table. So
yeah, they teach us that in law school. It depends. That's the standard answer.
Yeah. So I almost hesitate to use this word in the context of divorce, but thinking back over the last few years, what's maybe a client success that comes to mind? Given that it depends clearly, and
right.
given all of the potential moving parts in any single case, is there something that comes to mind for you of you walking away from that thinking like, that was a good outcome despite the circumstances?
Yeah. I don't want to go into too many details, but I have two, one financial and one custody related. I have a case from last year where my client had relocated to an Asian country with her husband and child. He was going to be teaching, and right before the pandemic hit, I think in January of last year, she found out that he was involved in an extramarital relationship, and she wanted to bring the child back home to Atlanta, and he had taken the child's passport. So we were able to assist her in getting an emergency court order here in Georgia for the State Department to issue a new passport and get him on a plane and come back. And then we wound up having a lengthy trial under the Hague Convention, which is an international custody, international treaty. So we had a trial in May in person in federal court here in Atlanta over whether she and the child would be permitted to stay here to proceed with the divorce, or whether the child would be sent back. And my partner, Melody, and I handled that and were successful and extremely happy when we got that decision. That was one of those, you open your email and your hands are shaking as you're reading the opinion.
Holy cow. And I mean, I'm kind of floored by the situation or the picture you just painted, but then I guess adding the international layer to all of that, and I'm guessing communication challenges and time zones and things like that. I mean, I can only imagine how challenging, but probably interesting that must have been.
Yes. It was actually my first case under that treaty. It was Melody's as well, but she had actually written an amicus brief for the United States for the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers, a group that she's a member of. She wrote an amicus brief for a Supreme Court case. So she was very well versed in the law. And so when my client got served with this petition under the Hague Convention, it's like, I know, I sort of had heart palpitations and looked at Melody, and she's like, "Oh, we got this. We're good. It's okay." So yeah, that was a very good thing. And then from the financial perspective, I just had a case a couple of months ago. It's still a divorce case. It's still ongoing, but we prevailed. We prevailed in a summary judgment related to separate property that swung the marital asset pot into a much larger asset category than the other side had hoped. And so that was another one where I got the order, and my client was she was very happy, but it was one of those orders that I read and I thought, maybe I just need to stop practicing law now. This is just such a great result. I might be done.
Get right on top, huh?
So, yeah, it's good. But yeah, family law, it's so discretionary with judges, and the interesting thing about it, or one of the interesting misnomers about it, is I think there are a lot of lawyers out there who think they can just dabble and that it's simple. But there are lots and lots of little technical intricacies that make it important to have someone in your corner who specializes in it. And this summary judgment issue is what I would cite as an example of that. It's just categorizing property as marital versus separate, and somebody trying to claim that they had separate property that ballooned during the marriage. You really need a lawyer who's going to understand the law on that, rather than just kind of making assumptions.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. Just to reiterate super clearly what you just said, if you're considering or being presented with a potential divorce or any kind of family law situation, it makes a whole hell of a lot of sense to interview and seek out an attorney that focuses on family law all the time, 100% of the time. Because as Kyla just stated, if you got somebody that's doing some family law, but they're also doing some estate planning or some business law here and there, I can't even imagine the challenge to keep up with any one discipline, let alone two or three or more. So I think that's an important point, and I'm glad you mentioned that. What's surprised you most about your work in family law over the years?
That's a tough question. Probably, the evolving nature of it, is one thing. Custody and parenting time in particular has evolved significantly over the years. There's been a bit of a shift in balance. I'm certainly over the last 5 years represented a lot more women in cases where they're the breadwinner, for various reasons. And so that has, that's not necessarily surprising. I guess, we sort of all have seen that coming as the workforce in some ways has equalized, although pay still has not. But the other thing is there's been a major flip in the judiciary in the Atlanta metro area just in the last 5 to 10 years, which is also natural. But we've lost a lot of judges in Fulton County and Cobb County in particular in the last few years with, just retirement and the nature of that. And so the changes in the judiciary have come with sort of evolving and changing attitudes towards family law and the structure of families. And that's something that has been a bit surprising in a good way. And not to say that the judges who have been doing this for a long time, it's great to have that body of experience. But at the same time, it's been refreshing to have, new sets of eyes here and there as well. And so that's been an interesting shift.
And kind of to carry that thought forward, I've experienced this anecdotally, and I'd love to get your thoughts or feedback. You mentioned a couple of times in our conversation how judges are going to trial. You're often putting your case in. Well, I shouldn't say often. You're putting your case basically in someone else's hand to make decisions, but the judge or the attorneys maybe bring their own biases is probably too strong a word, but their own kind of approach or philosophy or perspective to the table. So like recently, and I've experienced this before, but I have got a woman who was just referred to me in the last 30 days. She's early 60s, getting divorced after 35 plus years of marriage, but she's been a stay-at-home mom, raised 2 kids. And she told me, and I've heard this before from other attorneys, that generally, a lot of judges frown. I shouldn't say frown upon. They do not reward stay-at-home wives or stay-at-home moms as equitably as they might a woman that worked, if not full-time, had worked in the past. So I don't know if I'm explaining that very clearly, but is that something you've experienced, or is that something that you would, at least brushing with a broad stroke, would agree with?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely would. It's those cases are oftentimes, unfortunately, the hardest for us to handle because of the realities of it, and sort of the devaluing in our society of a stay-at-home parent. And it's going to be interesting to see how this, how it develops or continues to develop. Because once a couple of things, right? There are sort of an expectation based on age at the time of the divorce. And, it's a lot different if I've got a 40-year-old client who has a, bachelor's degree and has been a stay-at-home mom, versus a 60-year-old female client. And I'm actually, and occasionally, if I'm being honest, at this point, I have some 40-year-old male clients who have a bachelor's degree and have been a stay-at-home dad too. And so it's an even, that dynamic changes things. But when you're talking about somebody who's, 55 or 60, the considerations that go into that, it's difficult to say to somebody that age, oh, well, you need to go back to school and get a job, right?
Right.
But the flip side of that too is, I think a lot of judges view it as, the breadwinner. It's also not fair to expect that person to work until they're 75 years old in order to pay alimony to somebody else. So it's, if that's where you come in, right, is hopefully there are retirement assets, that are accumulated and divided equitably, that in a way, or equitably meaning fairly, so not equal, right? So that's the other part of Georgia law that's important to remember is, there's sort of this idea that when you get divorced, there's a pot of marital assets and they get divided 50-50. Well, oftentimes that's an equal division, but it's not equitable, especially when one spouse is going to continue to earn, and one does not have a great earning capacity. But yes, your question, the court system, with one or two exceptions, there's one judge who is sort of famous for his philosophy being, my mama got lifetime alimony when my dad divorced her, and so there you go. So if you're lucky enough to get that one particular judge, he brings his personal bias in favor of the stay-at-home mom. But a lot of that unfortunately does not happen often.
Well, to your earlier comment, the reason I commend you for encouraging people to settle or reach an agreement via mediation and not go to trial is because you're literally rolling the dice, and depending on what jurisdiction you're in and things like that, of which judge you get, and that particular judge's personal history or views on this. This is just a single example, but I'm sure there are others. So
sure.
I think that just helps emphasize the the need and the urgency to reach an agreement or find a settlement and avoid going to trial if at all possible.
Right.
What's a common misconception? I mean, arguably there's a ton of misconceptions about attorneys in general, and probably,
right.
probably family law specifically. But what's a common misconception about your work that you've experienced, either kind of broadly or maybe just specifically in communicating with clients?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's that we're all sharks, right? I mean, that's that, and that we're all dishonest. And that's and that we will encourage our clients to be dishonest. And that's one thing that for me philosophically, and part of the reason I joined this firm when I came out of the judge's office is that we all are lawyers who also have consciences that we need to sleep at night, right? We all sort of have the same philosophy of this thing, and my preference would be to preserve my clients' assets for them and for their children. I'll be fine. And so there is certainly a misconception that divorce lawyers are in it just to make money for themselves. And there certainly are some like that. But the misconception is that we are all that way. And like I said, I try to do everything with my clients in a cost benefit analysis way. Why would you pay me $10,000 to recover $5? That makes it doesn't make much sense,
right?
And so I try to give people a good reality check on how much something's going to cost. Both, like I said earlier, I think emotionally, there's an emotional cost that you can't really put a dollar on.
Well, and I think that's an important point, and I think it also harkens back to earlier when you talked about the importance of empathy. And just to be clear, for you to encourage people to settle via mediation or out of court, that's you making less money, because if you've got a lawyer up and go to trial, it's going to take longer, but it's going to cost a heck of a lot more money. And so, you need to recognize the attorney's motivations, good or bad, for the direction they're steering you. And there are certainly times when trial is worth it, right? Yeah. Sure. I mean, I like to tell my clients, listen, I am a competitive person. I was a competitive tennis player for a number of years until my knees decided that was not a great idea. I don't like to lose. And so I am not a lawyer who enjoys going to court and getting my ass kicked over an issue that I know it's going to go that way. I mean, but you can pay me a lot of money to do that, but I don't enjoy it even when I'm getting paid, because I don't like to lose. Right. And so going, there is no reason to do that when we have a reasonable understanding of what the outcome is likely to be. Now, when we have a reasonable understanding of what the outcome is likely to be, and the other side is taking a completely ridiculous position, there is certainly a time and a place to go to court. And I much prefer to do that when I have a good indication of which side of that I'm going to be on at the end. And I think my clients appreciate that more. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think clearly it makes sense to fight battles you feel like you got a good chance of winning. So
sure.
What and I don't going back and recognizing the fact that you earlier said it depends for each situation, but given that, what's a specific strategy or piece of advice that, while clearly it's not going to be suitable for every situation that that you're dealing with, you found to be particularly effective as it relates to divorce or family law in general?
So, and this comes from my judicial perspective, right? You get a lot of people who initially come in and they want to go tit for tat, and if the other side's being an asshole, they think it's going to benefit them to be an asshole back.
Right. Yes.
And that's just not the case.
Yeah.
This is judges especially where kids are concerned. And I have the luxury, I think, to some extent, with lawyers and clients, water seeks its own level. So I like to think of myself as a rational, strategic thinker. And it's a match, right? That's one of the things, circling back to when we were talking about, and I'm going a little bit off on a tangent here, but when we were talking about finding a lawyer who specializes, it's also important to find a lawyer who you trust from a personality. You have to have a personality perspective, right? I mean, professionally, of course. And everybody's not a personality match, right? I have certainly had consults with clients, and I have said, listen, I am not your lawyer. I can give you names of other folks. This is just not, and so I would say that, one of the things that attracted me to this firm when I was choosing where to go is we are all very much high road people. We all coach our clients. This is not the circumstance, despite what you've seen in movies and on TV shows. This is not the circumstance where you want to get down in the mud. A judge, the worst thing you can do is be the bad actor when you go in front of a court. And again, especially where your kids are concerned. So we spend a lot of time, coaching our clients, who many of whom are already of that mind frame, right? Which is great. But that's one of the, and I can circle this back to your misconception thing too, is, you want to be, to the extent possible, you want to be the one who is the one taking the high road. You do not want to be the one that a group of divorce lawyers are sitting around at a cocktail hour telling stories of their craziest clients and the craziest things they've done, because that happens.
Yeah. Well, and that'll have to be part 2 of our conversation. We'll have to do another episode and we can talk about the crazy ones.
Right. I'll talk about other people's crazy ones. I'm not gonna, I won't divulge any of mine. Right?
Well, attorney-client privilege and all that.
Right.
What and this is, I always like to ask this question. What if anything prevents people from following your advice? And that doesn't have to be like advice, big picture, but maybe like some of the smaller battles along the way.
I can't say that that's a problem I typically have. If you haven't figured it out already, I tend to be a pretty strong personality. And I tend to also, I don't want people to pay me for advice if they're not going to follow it. And so that can be a tough conversation to have with a client sometimes. But at the same time, if it is not a good personality match, if you're not, if they're not going to listen to me and follow advice, then perhaps there is someone else out there who they will listen to and who would have a better ability to communicate for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that happens. I would, or much. Occasionally, and that's not to say I'm always right. Certainly, I have had clients that I would say are smarter than I am in many ways. I mean, I'm not here giving them investment advice, and so hopefully they wouldn't follow that if I tried. I'll send them to you for that. But I think that sometimes it's hard to hear the tough advice. And so sometimes I would say and there are certainly times when I'm giving people tough advice and tough love. And so that's probably the biggest barrier, is just not wanting to hear it.
It sounds like it really just comes back to finding a good attorney-client relationship where there's a good fit, personality wise, professionally, philosophically. I mean, I think,
yes.
I got to think that solves a lot of problems before they happen. And also, I'd love a quick comment. Talking about like clients conserving their assets and their funds and things like that. I've seen a couple of clients get pretty far down the road with a family law attorney, only to, for whatever reason, hit an impasse, and they have to literally go back and start over with another attorney. And not just the financial expense, but the emotional expense of having to, basically go through that entire discovery process again with a new attorney and rehash stories you've already told and things like that. I mean, that's so yeah, I think maybe to kind of put a pin in this,
fun.
it's be very, very selective and choose wisely when, seeking out the right family attorney for you, or family law attorney for you.
For sure. Yeah. There were a couple of years ago, this hasn't happened as much lately, but it seems like with every, I don't know, you wind up dealing with the same 5 situations in a year and then you don't see it again for a while. But there were, and this is going to sound flippant, but, and I don't mean it that way, but I wound up charging a couple of different clients a lot more money than they should have had to pay anybody to try to undo what a past not great attorney had done. Right. And so I call it unscrambling eggs, so, these people are are put in a situation where they've, come to me as the second lawyer with kind of a bag of bad advice. And it's unfortunate because like, if I'd been your first lawyer, it would have been done differently to start with. The strategy would have been completely different. And so, I usually say that to folks, I'll do my best at unscrambling your eggs, but there's only so much of that I can do. I can try to shift the trajectory here. We can shift strategies. And so that is hard for me as a professional, to deal with, because of course, like I said, I have a conscience. It just doesn't feel right to me to have to do that, but I also hope that I am able to do it. Right.
Well, and clearly you want to get the best outcome for your clients, even if that means you've got to take a couple steps back to move forward on the right path. I like the unscrambling eggs analogy. That paints a pretty clear picture of what it is you're doing in those situations. So we've talked a lot about your practice of family law and the things that you do. So a lot of my listeners are women in their 50s, 60s, and older. Their family, their kids, even if they're adult kids, are one of the most important things in their lives. So a question I like to ask is, if let's say a high school senior or maybe a college undergrad is thinking about law school, or they've always been intrigued by the legal profession, and they hear this conversation and they're like, wow, Kyla sounds like a cool person. Family law sounds interesting, especially when we get to work on international cases and things like that, which I'm sure don't pop up every week. But if a high school senior, a college student is listening to this and they think, wow, I'd like to learn more. I'd maybe like to pursue a legal career, or maybe more specifically a career in family law. Any advice or guidance you'd give to someone like that?
Take a lot of psychology classes, because learning to sort of understand and discuss things with people and understand the personalities at play is a big piece of this job. The other thing, and this is actually just advice for anybody in that age range, and I don't, I've given this speech to a lot of people who kind of look at me cross-eyed sometimes, but almost every job you are going to have as an adult professional boils down to customer service. Right? I am in the job of customer service. My job is a customer service job. Your job is a customer service job. And so some of the best life experience, in my opinion, for a young person to have is some sort of a customer service job. I learned more from waitressing my way through college and a little bit in law school. I learned more about people and how to handle situations and how to think on my feet by doing those jobs. And how to be nice when you're having a crappy day, because your livelihood depends on it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that I'm not certain that is, and I'm going to sound like get off my lawn old person here, but I'm not certain that that's really something. The value in those jobs is something that is really imparted upon young people. For me, when I was 15 years old, I had a sister who was 10 years older than I was, and she had waitressed all through high school and high school, and then worked retail through college. And I was like, well, gee, I can make $350 an hour working at a gift shop, or I can make $10 an hour waitressing, at this restaurant. And so that was first job I had when I was 16 years old, was waiting tables. And it teaches you a lot about dealing with people that has made a huge difference for me in my ability to interact with bosses. When I worked for a judge and interact with the lawyers that were, hopefully voting for her and constituents. And then in this job as a lawyer who is ultimately serving my clients in difficult situations. So that's probably not what most of your undergrad, your law school aspiring law students really want to hear. But I think that it's something that's been lost a little bit on, on the 20 to 30 something, 35-ish, generation. I'm not going to bash millennials because I think they take way too much already. But I think that is such a huge piece of your ability to succeed as a professional.
What great advice. I mean, I love the idea of taking psychology and having a better understanding of just humans and all of our flaws and weird ways of making decisions. And frankly, I think the customer service and idea of waiting tables ties into that nicely too, because it gives you a peek into different people, and rude people and polite people, and people that tip well and don't, and dealing with your coworkers and juggling priorities. And I agree. I think that's great life advice, but specifically good advice for someone that's considering maybe a law career of some flavor or another. So thanks for sharing that. Kyla, this is, I feel like you and I could probably talk for another hour easily, but
I agree. This is great.
You good for another few questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Cool. So this is Women's Retirement Radio. It's all about, women in their 50s, 60s, thinking about kind of the next chapter in their life and retirement. And clearly that word is loaded and means very different things to very different people. But when you think about the word retirement, what comes to mind for you personally?
Oh gosh. Well, I'll tell a story of what hopefully active, right? I mean, that's everybody's goal, right? I hope that's everybody's goal, right? Is to be able to actively enjoy my retirement. And I gotta say, I kind of flip flop on that, because to some extent, like, well, I want to spend a lot of money now when I'm still in my 40s and in good health. But at the same time, and thankfully my husband is of the other, like, no, we're going to save for retirement so that we can live it up during our retirement, right? So gosh, travel goals. And then we also kind of have that conversation about, what would we do? What would we do? Ideally. And I can't imagine that I'm not still going to be, as a retired person, actively volunteering, or I don't know, something is going to have to occupy my day. But, all of that comes with financial security, right? And the ability to. And so I tend to think more, and this is just my personality type, I tend to think more about the dreaminess of it rather than the reality of it. And thankfully, I have a partner who thinks more about the reality of it, and everybody doesn't have that luxury. So I also, it's one of those things that I always thought, oh my gosh, that's just so far off. And, I am now quickly approaching 50. And so it's not as far off as it used to seem. I have plenty of time. Really, not so much anymore.
Well, it sounds like you and your husband are well balanced as far as thinking about and planning ahead for the financial responsibilities that will face you down the road. So that's a good thing. Yeah. But I agree. I mean, there's a lot of research that supports like people that retire but don't really have something to retire to, whether that's family, volunteering, maybe working part-time and more of a kind of like a passion project type job. Their health declines.
I want to be in a flower shop.
Say again?
I just want to be in a flower shop. I just
you
want to
go.
be surrounded by flowers.
There you go.
Right. That's how I envision retirement.
There you go.
Gardening and flowers.
Well, but you also raise an important point, which is a lot of people can kind of even unconsciously kind of sign up for the deferred life plan. Like, I'm going to live it up once I'm 65 and retired and have more time. But, to your point, which I think is an important one, you don't know what your health is going to be like. You don't know what the world's going to be like then. You don't know if we're going to be in a travel lockdown or who the heck knows what will be. We'll living with that at that time. So I think there's a lot to be said for striking a balance between being well prepared for an uncertain future and living a great life today. So, I commend you. It sounds like you've got a healthy attitude as you kind of think about retirement down the road. So, I know you mentioned earlier that you found yourself working more in the last few years, with more women breadwinners in families, things like that. But clearly, you also kind of alluded to the fact that there are still some challenges specific to women thinking about retirement, whether that's kind of the pay gap or the fact that women live longer. Generally, what do you see as the biggest challenge that women specifically face when they're planning for retirement?
Well, I mean, that's sort of, we still sort of, from a societal perspective, I think I still see more women who lack knowledge of the financial picture, right? And so, with your audience being who they are, I'm not sure I'm going to be saying anything helpful to them because we're already, we're already in the situation. And so, but what I see a lot of still in my practice is, women who are, even if they're also, have had a job, they've been the ones who have sort of, managed the payment of the day-to-day bills. But as far as knowledge of investments and investment vehicles and, where the assets are, they lack that knowledge. And that is just, it's something that I'm hoping we're going to see shift more and more. But, from a societal perspective, I think that's just kind of one of the traditional things that has still not shifted as much as many traditional things have. And so, that's, I think, where it's important for somebody like you to come in who can help educate people, women in particular, about, what their options are and what the picture is. And so for the, anybody who's listening who is, contemplating divorce or sees it coming, educating yourself sooner rather than later is critically important, I think.
Yeah.
We see, and I'm sure you see a lot, if I have, and occasionally we'll consult with somebody pre-divorce, who hasn't made the decision what to do yet. I also do, prenuptial agreements is one of the things that I didn't talk about. And so when I have a client who, is a younger person who is getting a prenup and, it's a female who perhaps isn't the one with the assets going in and is likely to, stay at home if they have kids, I always tell that person, let's, put part of this in the prenup is that there will be contributions to a retirement account in your name, as part of this. And so, I know for a lot of folks, hindsight's 2020 and there's coulda, woulda, shoulda. But for anybody who still has that as an option, ensuring that there are investments, that are, title doesn't matter, but at the same time, it's helpful if you can ensure that there's some balance there.
All great points, and I agree. I mean, you probably see this under a microscope regularly, where, and it doesn't always fall along the stereotypical gender lines, where it's the Correct. Man makes the money, the woman is kind of out of the loop with the family finances. I've seen the reverse be true as well.
As have I. Sure.
But it's just really, it's almost heartbreaking to see sometimes when a lot of wealth has been accumulated to millions of dollars, and one of the partners is largely out of the loop. as far as the family finances, how they work, how decisions have been made, why decisions have been made. And I found that's where, kind of to use your analogy earlier of unscrambling eggs, I've found myself in the position to be introduced to often women coming out of a divorce, and they've got some big financial decisions to make, and they're bright, capable, educated women, but they're just not familiar with it, and not being familiar with it, they don't have confidence, and so a lot of times they just kind of get paralyzed by what they think is the enormity of it, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I think I'm kind of rambling, but want to put an exclamation point on what you shared about, it's never too late to get more educated, to talk to people, to learn. There's so many resources online that are free. There's books you can read. So yeah, make sure you're arming yourself for good days ahead. But in the event you find yourself facing the loss of a spouse or divorce or something like that, you need to be extra well prepared and have an understanding of what's going on. So super important. And I'm glad you highlighted that. So as I think we've kind of been dancing around, divorce, especially for women later in their life, can be really, really impactful. Often negatively so. How would you characterize your work as impacting women and their families as they plan for or transition into retirement? Maybe as it relates to divorce.
Well, one thing I will say too is, yes, we have danced around this, but we've also kind of painted this, and I think I've done this as well, as horrifying and scary. Let me tell you, I've had a lot of clients who are just thrilled to come out on the other side of this. If you've been in an unhappy marriage or an unhappy relationship for a long period of time, oftentimes, and this is, I don't want to be the divorce lawyer advocating for divorce, but I certainly have many clients who, oftentimes it's their choice to move forward with it. Oftentimes, even when it's not, though, once you get through it all and you come out on the other end, I have clients I run into 2 years later who are just, happy.
Yeah.
Right. And happy for the first time in a very long time. And so I do want to at least recognize that. I'm glad you highlighted that, because that's absolutely the case. And I think we're kind of talking about finances, but I'm thinking of them more in isolation. Sure. I too have encountered women and men that, a few months or a few years down the road post divorce, they'll tell you they're in the best place they've ever been in their lives. So, but I interrupted. Go ahead. Yep. And no, that's okay. The one thing I will say too, and maybe I'm trying to take your negative and put a positive, or not that you were being negative, but you know what I mean. Yeah. Control, right? I mean, if there's something liberating and impactful about having control of your destiny. And so, whether it's somebody who's coming out of a divorce with not as much as they hoped for, but then, working with somebody like you to help them plan for the future, to be the one who is able to harness that. And, this is also coming from a person who might be a little controlling. So
we're not pointing any fingers here.
No. I joke. That's one of those things that people call me controlling. Yeah. What's wrong with that? It's like somebody calling me competitive. Well, who likes to lose? These are good things as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
And so I think that, and I'm not sure I answered your question, but I think that, that is something that is just kind of hugely impactful post-divorce, is to be able to recognize and acknowledge that, you're the one. You get to, and it's scary, especially if it's the first time in your life that you've really been the one, totally in the driver's seat, but it's refreshing.
And I think it can also be empowering too, once they get their feet under them and kind of, see a path forward, which I think you help pave for them and getting them through the divorce process, hopefully as quickly and painlessly as possible. So,
Right.
So as we start to wrap up, Kyla, again, this has been great. I'm glad we're having this conversation and able to share it with our listeners. You've already kind of touched on, having played tennis and loving to go to, concerts and musical performances. So maybe you've already answered this, but if you've got I say if, not when, if you've got an hour or two all by yourself, like how do you enjoy spending that?
Oh gosh. I usually will read New York Times cooking recipes and menu plan, or I like to cook as well. So if I've got some free time, I peruse the what to cook this week email and usually try to come up with something that sounds good.
What's your favorite go-to recipe?
Oh my goodness. Oh, there are so many. That all I can say is, and here's my bit of financial advice. I think it's like a $40 a year subscription to the New York Times for their cooking bit. It is the best money you could spend. And there are just a few. There are a couple of the chefs in particular that I tend to, Melissa Clark and Sam Sifton, pretty much anything by either one of them.
Yeah.
But and my husband is during COVID mastered cooking Indian food. So he's got quite a few Indian recipes that he has been doing. But I tend to go more towards Thai food and other Asian recipes. I also like to bake. If I were going to bake anything, if I were going to do anything, it would be baking, typically cake or cobbler type things. Cookies occasionally.
Awesome.
So I can't pick one. That's just impossible.
Yeah.
Well, it's like asking me to pick a favorite band.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. We'll be sure to share a link to the New York Times subscription cooking resource in the show notes. That's really cool. As we wrap up, we've covered a ton. We can probably cover a ton more, but if there were one thing that our listeners could take away from our conversation today, what would you want that one thing to be?
Oh gosh. Divorce doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't have to be a bad thing.
Nice.
I think that's really it.
Yeah. I think that's a nice, succinct way to kind of wrap up our conversation today. So if someone's listening, Kyla, they want to learn more about you, your firm, the work you do, what's the best way that people could reach out or learn more or find you online?
So I'll tell a funny story. I met my husband. We mentioned a few times already. I'm just getting so thrilled with saying the word, right? I met him on an online dating site 11 years ago, and I had a fake name because if you Google Kyla, Kyla, Atlanta, you're going to find me. There aren't a lot of us. So I had a fake name for that, so I would ensure that I wasn't going to get chopped up into little pieces.
Smart thinking.
So right, but to really answer your question, our website is RB Richardson Bloom and Line, so rblfamilylaw.com. Is probably the easiest way to reach me, and then all of our contact information is on that website.
Great. We'll
if you Google Kyla Atlanta and you'll find that website.
Well, I'm glad that 11 years on, you and your now husband made it work. So, the fake name was not a deterrent. And we'll be sure to share a link to the website and your LinkedIn profile and things like that. So if people want to reach out, learn more, talk, maybe they know someone that needs to talk to you about this sort of stuff, they can certainly reach out and get in touch. So, sure. Kyla, this has been great. I appreciate your time and sharing a little bit about your experience and expertise with us. This has been fun.
Thank you for having me. It has been fun.
Yeah. And to everyone out there listening, thanks again for joining us. This is Russ with Women's Retirement Radio, and we look forward to catching up with you on our next episode. It's Russ again. And before you go, I want to provide a brief disclosure. You should consult a financial advisor familiar with the specific circumstances of your unique financial situation before making any financial decisions. Nothing in this broadcast constitutes a solicitation for the sale or purchase of any securities. Any mentioned rates of return are historical or hypothetical in nature and are not a guarantee of future returns. I'm a financial advisor and an investment advisor representative of WealthCare Capital Management, LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor based in Richmond, Virginia. The views discussed in this podcast are my own and may not be consistent with or represent those of WealthCare Capital Management.